Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Merdeka! 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 Saudara-saudara, rakyat jelata di seluruh Indonesia, kita semuanya telah mengetahui bahwa hari ini tentara Inggris telah menyebarkan pamflet-pamflet yang memberikan suatu ancaman kepada kita semua. Kita diwajibkan menyerahkan senjata-senjata yang telah kita rebut dari tangannya tentara Jepang. Mereka telah minta supaya kita datang pada mereka.
Surabaya stood at the edge of a new era, carrying the hope of freedom and the uncertainty of what would come next. For ordinary people, independence was no longer only an announcement. It was a responsibility they had to protect. Across the city, ordinary citizens began organizing themselves, preparing for a future that suddenly depended on their courage. Yet beneath the excitement, uncertainty was growing. Every movement in the streets could carry news of a new confrontation.
For those who had waited for freedom, the red and white flag became more than a symbol. It became a promise worth defending.
The arrival of Allied forces changed the atmosphere.
Suspicion grew on both sides. In a city already armed with emotion, even a small misunderstanding could become dangerous. Local leaders understood that the city needed discipline. Negotiation was still possible, but every decision had to be made under enormous pressure. Checkpoints appeared across Surabaya as young volunteers tried to control movement and protect their neighborhoods.
Radio became one of the most important tools in the city, carrying information and strengthening the resolve of people who could not see the entire battlefield.
Behind the scenes, Allied commanders were trying to establish control, while Indonesian representatives struggled to preserve the authority of the Republic.
News traveled quickly through messengers and word of mouth. In a tense city, information could change the mood of an entire neighborhood within minutes.
For ordinary people, independence was no longer only an announcement. It was a responsibility they had to protect. By late October, the distance between the two sides was becoming harder to maintain. Across the neighborhoods, young volunteers began turning ordinary streets into defensive positions. Rumors moved faster than facts, forcing messengers like Suryono to search for reliable information.
The Allied presence was becoming increasingly visible, and every patrol reminded Surabaya that control of the city was being contested.
To many Indonesians, the flag represented a sovereignty that had only recently been declared, and now demanded protection.
Behind closed doors, representatives still searched for a peaceful solution, knowing that open warfare could devastate the city. Among the volunteers were men like Hassan, ordinary citizens who were increasingly drawn toward the defense of their neighborhoods. Behind the men at the barricades stood thousands of civilians, keeping neighborhoods alive while the tension outside continued to rise. Every message mattered. Radio operators worked to keep information moving through a city where communication could mean survival.
By the end of October, the city was no longer simply waiting for trouble. It was preparing for the possibility that trouble had already arrived.
By now, small defensive positions were appearing throughout Surabaya, reflecting a growing fear that negotiation might fail. Food, water, and medical supplies were quietly collected, because everyone understood that civilians would bear much of the coming hardship.
The Allied patrols were also becoming more cautious, aware that Surabaya's streets were no longer politically neutral ground.
Women such as Rukmini prepared medical supplies, knowing that the coming violence would not spare civilians.
Strategic roads and bridges became increasingly important, because whoever controlled them could influence movement across the city. Volunteers understood that the bridges and main roads could become decisive positions if fighting erupted. Radio broadcasts would soon become one of the strongest voices of resistance, reaching listeners throughout Surabaya.
In homes across the city, people listened closely, searching for news and trying to understand what might happen next.
Negotiations continued, but neither side fully trusted the intentions of the other.
As negotiations weakened, preparations quietly became more serious. Surabaya was beginning to prepare for a battle it still hoped would never come. Couriers became essential links between neighborhoods, carrying information when roads and communication lines could no longer be trusted.
The city seemed almost peaceful from above, while the atmosphere around Surabaya was gradually becoming more uncertain.
At the same time, Allied troops were moving through the city with increasing confidence, unaware of how deeply local resistance had taken root. For civilians, every unfamiliar vehicle and every sudden movement became a reason to close their doors and prepare for the worst. Surabaya was entering a dangerous silence. Within days, that silence would be shattered by one of the fiercest battles of Indonesia's independence struggle. As clashes spread, messengers became the city's nervous system, carrying warnings from one neighborhood to another. For families caught between the opposing forces, survival often meant finding the nearest safe room and waiting for the danger to pass.
Medical volunteers prepared wherever they could, knowing that the wounded would soon need help close to the fighting.
Smoke began to rise over parts of the city, turning the possibility of a major battle into an immediate reality.
Allied troops advanced carefully, facing a city where resistance could emerge from almost any street or neighborhood.
The defenders knew they were outmatched in equipment, but they had the advantage of knowing the streets and neighborhoods intimately.
Surabaya's dense streets and narrow alleys would soon become the stage for a battle fought block by block.
Many defenders had little formal military experience. What they possessed was determination, local knowledge, and a willingness to stand their ground.
Behind every defensive position was a network of civilians providing food, water, shelter, and encouragement.
Both sides increasingly depended on communication, but the meaning of each message could determine what happened next. Night brought no real rest. Volunteers moved through dark streets, preparing positions while families waited behind closed doors.
The radio connected frightened families to a city that was rapidly changing outside their walls.
Morning returned, but the city was no longer the same. Surabaya was moving steadily toward a confrontation that history would remember.
For volunteers like Rukmini, courage meant staying close to danger because others needed someone willing to help.
Then the waiting ended. Gunfire erupted across the streets, turning tension into open battle.
Hassan and other volunteers fought from cover, using the streets they knew as their greatest advantage. On the other side,
Move forward!
Allied troops advanced with superior equipment, trying to push through the resistance street by street. Messengers like Suryono risked crossing dangerous streets because information could determine whether a neighborhood survived the next attack.
Behind the front line, volunteers fought another battle, keeping the wounded alive while the city continued to shake around them.
For ordinary families, the battle meant abandoning homes, carrying only what they could hold, and searching for a safer street.
Resistance spread from one position to another, forcing the advancing troops to confront defenders across a maze of streets.
Pertahankan tempat ini!
The resistance slowed the advance, turning every intersection into another tactical problem for the Allied forces. Buildings that had stood for years were suddenly transformed into shelters, observation points, and reminders of the cost of war.
After every exchange of fire came a brief moment to regroup, reload, and decide where to make the next stand. Across Surabaya, the confrontation had become a true battle. Supplies had to cross the same dangerous streets as the fighters, making every short journey a test of courage. Against heavier Allied equipment, the defenders relied increasingly on mobility, cover, and their knowledge of Surabaya's streets.
The Belteniers to the Twensrivs from Indonesia.
By this stage, Surabaya was no longer merely resisting an advancing force.
The defenders understood that every street they held could delay the advance for another crucial moment. The Allied forces pushed forward with greater firepower.
Keep moving!
But the resistance made every advance slower and more difficult.
Even away from the barricades, civilians faced the constant danger of collapsing buildings and stray fire.
Couriers carried warnings through the chaos, helping defenders reposition before another Allied advance. When a position became impossible to hold, the defenders withdrew, regrouped, and prepared to resist from somewhere else. Every advance demanded new decisions, because resistance could shift from one neighborhood to another without warning. Supplies followed the fighters, carried by volunteers who kept the resistance functioning. Under constant pressure, heavy firepower brought destruction far beyond the immediate fighting, placing entire neighborhoods under threat.
For the fighters who remained, exhaustion could not become an excuse to stop. The battle demanded another position, another stand. Surabaya was becoming a battlefield on an enormous scale, and the resistance was entering the darkest and most decisive phase of the struggle.
Some defenders turned damaged buildings into temporary strongholds, using every wall and window as protection. Every building became a potential defensive position, forcing the advancing troops to move with caution.
Keep your eyes on the window!
The defenders answered the advance with concentrated fire, forcing the attackers to take cover before moving again.
Hold the line!
The resistance was fluid. Fighters shifted through alleys and side streets, refusing to remain an easy target.
Medical volunteers continued working under pressure, often with limited supplies, and no certainty that the fighting would stop.
For civilians, every broadcast carried uncertainty. No one knew how long the fighting would continue or what the next morning would bring. With armored vehicles and heavy support entering the battle, the pressure on the defenders increased dramatically.
Instead of surrendering the streets, the defenders improvised new barricades and prepared for the next assault.
By now, the battle had become a defining test of resistance. Surabaya was paying a terrible price. After hours of fighting, exhaustion spread through the defenders. But the resistance had not collapsed. For civilians, every pause in the fighting was a chance to step outside, search for loved ones, and understand what remained of their neighborhood.
Medical supplies were running low, but the volunteers continued preparing for whoever might arrive next.
Organization became essential. Small groups were sent toward different streets, keeping the resistance active across the city. The defenders kept moving, refusing to let the loss of one position become the end of the resistance.
The Allied forces continued securing strategic positions, gradually increasing pressure on the areas still controlled by resistance fighters.
From concealed positions, the defenders watched the advancing columns and prepared for another confrontation.
Again, the streets became a battlefield, with both sides fighting for control of the same few blocks.
Even during battle, the struggle was not only about fighting. It was also about protecting the people caught in its path.
Across Surabaya, the fighting had become a citywide struggle, drawing civilians, volunteers, soldiers, and entire neighborhoods into its consequences.
Every warning mattered, because an approaching column could change the fate of an entire street within minutes.
The Allied advance continued cautiously, with soldiers aware that resistance could appear from almost any building.
Behind the fighting, another struggle continued, moving food, water, ammunition, and medical supplies through dangerous streets.
Every medical supply was valuable, because the fighting was creating new casualties faster than volunteers could prepare.
From elevated positions, defenders could see how rapidly the battle was spreading across Surabaya. Military columns continued moving through the city, bringing greater pressure against the remaining resistance positions.
Bridges and major roads became strategically important because controlling them meant controlling movement through the city.
At strategic crossings, resistance could become especially intense, as both sides understood the importance of controlling the route.
For young couriers like Suryono, courage often meant continuing forward despite exhaustion and fear.
The battle continued to consume Surabaya, but the resistance remained determined to hold its ground for as long as it could. By the afternoon, the defenders were exhausted, but they continued moving between positions whenever the pressure became too great.
As the fighting intensified, many civilians were forced to leave homes that had suddenly become part of the battlefield.
Inside makeshift medical stations, volunteers faced another battle, keeping people alive while the fighting continued outside.
The advancing forces studied each position carefully, preparing to push deeper into the areas where resistance remained.
The defenders knew another attack was approaching, and there was little time left to prepare.
Then the confrontation erupted again, filling the street with gunfire, smoke, dust, and the sound of collapsing masonry.
When a position could no longer be held safely, the defenders withdrew in small groups, rather than allowing the entire line to collapse.
Couriers continued connecting scattered defensive groups, carrying information that could mean the difference between preparation and surprise. As daylight began to fade, the destruction across Surabaya became even more visible beneath the smoke and dying light. Another day of battle was ending, but the struggle for Surabaya was far from over. When darkness arrived, the defenders used the brief pause to reorganize, knowing that another confrontation could come at any moment. Fatigue was everywhere. Yet even in moments of silence, the volunteers understood that the next decision could determine who controlled the street.
While fighters prepared for another night of combat, medical volunteers prepared for the wounded they knew might soon arrive.
Across the city, the Allied forces also prepared for another day of resistance, securing positions and organizing their advance.
Even at night, couriers continued moving through dangerous streets, carrying information between isolated groups of defenders.
Even after sunset, the battle never truly disappeared. Gunfire continued to remind the city that the struggle was far from finished. For the defenders, the night offered little rest. They knew that morning would bring another test of their resolve. Morning arrived over a city transformed by battle, but the defenders were still standing and still preparing to resist. The battle was no longer only a military confrontation. It had become a test of endurance for an entire population of Setekals. Surabaya had entered a struggle that would leave a lasting mark on Indonesia's history. The fighting was still continuing. With every hour of resistance, the defenders adapted their positions, turning damaged streets into temporary lines of defense.
The Allied advance continued, moving carefully through streets where resistance could emerge without warning.
Messages still had to travel quickly, because the resistance depended on communication between scattered positions. Behind the front lines, volunteers transformed ordinary rooms into makeshift medical stations, ready for the next wave of casualties. Observation became just as important as firepower. Knowing where the opposing forces were moving helped defenders decide where to hold and where to withdraw.
Once contact was made, the quiet streets could become violent in seconds, forcing both sides to react immediately.
Take cover!
For ordinary families, the battle was experienced through fear, uncertainty, and the constant hope that the violence would pass. Even under fire, the defenders tried to move their wounded and supplies away from exposed positions.
By now, the scale of the destruction showed that Surabaya had become one of the most intense arenas of Indonesia's struggle for independence. With the morning came another difficult task: rebuilding defensive positions and preparing for whatever the next hours would bring. For civilians, the destruction was deeply personal. Homes, streets, and familiar places had become reminders of how much the battle had already changed the city.
Medical volunteers worked continuously, knowing that every prepared bandage and bottle of water could become critical before the day was over.
The pressure from the Allied advance continued, forcing resistance fighters to make difficult decisions about where they could still hold their positions. Coordination became essential. The defenders had to understand the changing streets and decide where their limited strength could make the greatest difference. Positions could change quickly. A defensive line abandoned in one street might become a new line of resistance only a few blocks away. Once the opposing forces met again, the struggle returned to the streets, where every building and intersection could become a defensive position. Couriers like Suryono remained vital because resistance depended on people willing to cross spaces where the fighting had not yet stopped. For many Indonesians, the struggle was about more than a single street. The Battle of Surabaya would leave sacrifice and resistance of November 1945, Indonesia's struggle for independence,